I will kick it off, and we'll let Chris add the one thing to his bio that we missed, which was the important thing. So before we get into and to maybe pick up a little bit on the prior panel, let's define privacy and let's define security before we get into this. And the way to think of it really is privacy's a subset of data risk, meaning your company will have data, you will want to use it. And by using it, you're creating first-party risk when you make choices about it. Privacy is a very narrower issue, which is how do you address risks you create about data that reasonably identifies a person. Security is a third-party risk, and it really goes much more to resiliency, although data can as well. Security is how do you prevent yourself from being attacked by a third party using an information system or a data attack. And these tend to get lumped together, but as we talk about it, you really have to unbundle them to understand them. Just to pick up on what General Mattis was saying, we all talk about resilience, and it's one of those words like governance I think we use a lot that we never define. To me, resilience is the ability to resist and recover from an event, usually a third party attacking you. And I think one of the things, having done this for more than a few years, we focus on the resisting a lot. In the private sector, we're not so good at the recovery. And I think that's one of the things, particularly with cyber, is, as Drew and I have lived the dream for a little while recently, the ability to you're not going to stop these threat actors, and General Mattis can tell you better than I can, but you have to improve your ability to recover. So when we talk about cyber, we'll cover that as well. But Chris, since I'll just say I've been doing this since '99 when Chris and I met at Baker, and Chris went on to work for this small little startup that I managed to help him with a little bit with the privacy work. Maybe you can add to your bio what's a bit more relevant, Chris.
So I spent 4 years as the general counsel and chief privacy officer of Facebook when it was. I joined when it was 25 people. I left when it was about 1,000 people. I left to run for attorney general against this up-and-comer named Kamala Harris here in California.
How'd that go?
Again, she got 30% of a 7-way primary vote. I got 17, and second is first loser, right?
Yeah.
So.
Awesome. Well, let's start with looking at how should companies look at privacy, particularly at the early stages. Chris, why don't we start with you and then just work down the panel?
I mean, I think that at the earliest stages, you have to think about what the company is doing with data. I mean, it's all about the understanding the how it fits into the business model. And obviously, in the early days of Facebook, we were going to be about targeting ads in mostly anonymous space, but obviously we were going to hold an immense amount of personal information, and we were asking people to tie it to their real names. And so we had a special levels of risk that we had to think about. We did have a couple of breaches here and there where we had to notify and operate, and got through them okay. And I had helped write the California breach notice static, one of the first breach notification laws, so kind of knew a bit about the drill. But we executed well, and obviously we got hit on privacy over and over again. We expected that we would, but what we tried to do was to sort of get out in front of it as much as we could.
Yeah, Drew, what about from your perspective?
Sure. Yeah, I think, and I know we'll talk a bit about some of the regulations in place today, but I think when you think about it, there's that risk that you carry whenever you're using data that can come from a security perspective. But then when you think about what you want to use, and as Chris is mentioning with, especially if your company's built upon the usage of data, you really need to think about it in terms of whether you have encumbered data or unencumbered data, with the goal being for usage, how do you get to unencumbered data, such as through anonymization and consent and other means. And I think if you're looking at things along that trajectory, then you know that when something's encumbered, there's a bunch of rules and there are restrictions. If you're able to put safeguards in place to where you can shift it to be unencumbered, that's where you can open things up for a lot more innovation, but you can't just conflate the two and not follow those rules and safeguards along the way. And the whole time, you have to be thinking about how you're protecting it from a security standpoint regardless.
Yeah, I would say I think you have to just I'd echo what Drew and Chris said. Privacy law is big. It's changing really rapidly. It's evolving, and it's really not possible to be totally compliant with privacy laws either. So I think, like Chris said, you got to look at the business model, the company, the data, and balance sort of the risks and the benefits and figure out what is your risk profile based on how you need to use data, what data you have, how long you've had it, and make some decisions early on and work towards that. But try to be proactive a bit. Otherwise, you're always going to be playing catch up and you're in a defensive position, which you don't want to be in, right?
And the thing I'd add is, look, I think, and taking maybe the data issue in a broader way too, there's really two risks your company has in any domain, I think from an ERM perspective: resiliency risk and legal compliance risk. And it's always one of those two. You have different root causes that cause it. Where I see companies really get in a lot of trouble with data or privacy as a subset is when it presents resiliency risk. Because most of the time, and Chris knows this all too well, the question you're asked as the lawyer is it legally compliant? And the answer may be yes currently, or maybe it is, but it may not be a resilient practice. And one of the odder things that I have to do in my practice is I'm called in occasionally to spike M&A deals where there's a data problem and the company that's doing the acquisition is worried about it. And we had one last year where the data wasn't identifiable. So it wasn't a privacy issue, but it was the company had built certain IP based upon data that they had collected in a way that they hadn't fully disclosed to their customers or to the end user. And the issue was their IP may have been tainted. And so I think one of the things, particularly as a startup, you really have to be focused on is you can get an answer that is legally compliant, but when you get to later stage and they call in someone like me to diligence your company, I'm going to look at it in a much broader way. And that's a data rights issue and a broader thing. And so when you're thinking about privacy, don't just think about, even at an early stage, hey, can we make a legal argument or can we shift it with the risk to our customer with indemnity, because it may not matter. And so I think that's just something you've got to really think through, the resiliency risk of the data side of the equation, because it can have a real impact on your company.
For sure.
Which kind of goes into probably the next question, which is, what AI is doing apart from everything else is it's finally allowing data to be monetized, because if you think about the ecosystem, data is where the value sits and AI is how you release the data. So if you don't have the data and you don't have it unencumbered in the right way, it's valueless, right? And so as we're looking at AI, Kate, maybe I'll kind of kick it to you, which is how is that driving changes in privacy law? How are companies reacting now to privacy issues now that AI is in play?
Yeah, sure. I mean, AI is data-driven. It relies on a lot of data, right? I think historically, maybe the last 20 years, privacy law has really focused on the sensitivity of the data in and of itself inherently, with the idea being certain data is more sensitive, so in the wrong hands, it's just inherently more dangerous. But AI is changing that a little bit, and now the way we're looking at it more is looking at the outcome, right? The possibility for misinformation or manipulation or negative outcomes doesn't necessarily depend on the inherent sensitivity of the data. And I think you're starting to see that reflected in a lot of regulator enforcement, policy guidelines that are coming out, and also in privacy laws too. And, borrowing from the GDPR, this concept of automated decision making, putting in place additional legal and compliance obligations around certain uses of data that could result in negative outcomes, regardless of whether the data in and of itself is inherently sensitive.
Yeah, I think to add to that, you can think about you have your existing obligations with privacy compliance, regardless of whether or not you're using AI. So then you can either comply with the law at speed and at scale that AI affords you, or breach the law at speed and at scale that AI can make available to you by virtue of the fact that handling data in a non-compliant way, if you're putting it into AI, that you could have big outcomes as far as that goes. But at the same time, privacy law is not a good proxy for regulating, to your point, all the output of AI or anything like that. And that's where I think there were some weird things when ChatGPT became very popular, where, for example, you saw the Italian Data Protection Authority go and do an all-out ban on use of AI, and it wasn't clear what privacy equities were at stake versus what other equities that we continue to talk about with regard to deepfakes and everything else were maybe at stake at the time. And so I think that's really important to see that there's a Venn diagram for sure with that regulation, because you are dealing with data, but privacy is merely just a subset in terms of the things you have to worry about with AI.
Yeah, the training aspect of it. I mean, the large language models are the core of what's currently most AI, and so they depend on access to a ton of data, and the training data informs the way that the AI operates. Companies have taken great lengths to protect access to some of their own proprietary data, to only train it, the LLMs that they're using internally on their own data. And that is going to need to continue. A lot of the scraping that's gone on to train a number of these models is going to be the source of a number of interesting corporate fights and lawsuits over the coming years.
Well, and look, we've seen it in healthcare for years, which is some of the larger PBMs, when they take data and try to improve healthcare outcomes for their members, sometimes those companies will negotiate pricing based upon the use of data if they can reuse the learnings. And so I think one of the things that's underlying this, really to pick up on what Chris is saying, is if you're monetizing someone else's data, funny enough, they may ask you for a cut of the action. And I think that's where we're going to start going, is once companies realize there's value, there's going to be a lot of fights over the scraping issue for sure.
And interestingly enough, this is one of the areas where technological innovation, and particularly the blockchain stuff that I'm focused on now, can be very interesting in empowering people to make choices about their own use of data and being the custodian of their own data while still allowing access to others. There are quite a number of companies that are developing fascinating solutions in this space.
Well, why don't we pivot to cyber, and we'll kind of tee that up. For better or worse, I've sort of been one of the people that gets called for some of these fun incidents. And, I think maybe, again, to pick up on the theme of the prior panel, what the private sector doesn't realize, and I say this having been cleared for a long time now, you're the target. And while the MSS and the FSB and the SVR will want to hack the government, and they try and sometimes do, they're going to hack you to get it. And, I've done, of the recent ones you've heard of, SolarWinds, Progress Move It, VF Corp, working a little bit with CrowdStrike on something you might have heard of. And
really?
I know, shocking. And if you're following the news, there's a new telco breach where the Chinese breached a series of telcos to get into their CALIA databases, which is the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, so they can find out basically what the Bureau's been pulling on domestic targets. And so of all of those, I also did the Anthem breach, which was more than a few years ago now. That to me is probably the worst one I've done.
You're an adrenaline junkie.
I am. And the reason was it looked like a healthcare breach where they stole 80 million socials, which was what it looked like on the surface. What it was is the MSS staging a series of intel actions because, funny enough, Anthem was the insurer for a number of state governments and the federal government. So they had everyone's real name, everyone's real social, and their employers. And so they had a list then of who really worked at the CIA and DOD and could then roll up that and started rolling up spy networks when they hacked OPM to get everyone's clearance information. Yep. And so what you need to realize is while you may not even be a cleared defense contractor and don't think you're in the middle of this, if you have data that a foreign hostile threat actor wants, they're going to get in and they're sure as hell going to try to take it. And so when we talk about cyber, there is this sort of private versus public divide. That's not how the threat actors look at it. It is very much a state-sponsored activity. And Drew, obviously, CrowdStrike is, I think, the best at this. Maybe you can talk about Threat Landscape, Salt Typhoon, and some of the other stuff you're seeing.
Sure, yeah. The way we think about adversaries and the way we track them, we track over 200 distinct adversaries, is we have nation-state actors, e-crime actors, and then non-state actors. And you can think of non-state actors including hacktivist groups, and even now more and more groups that are actually pretending to be hacktivist groups, but are actually working on behalf of a state actor. With that, a lot of what we've seen affecting the private sector in the past year and a half, for example, would be you see groups like Scattered Spider e-crime actors, where they're using social engineering and taking it to the next level to get legitimate credentials. So if you have legitimate credentials into an organization, then that's a lot harder to detect what's going on than when we were very focused as an industry on malware, for example, whereas 70% of attacks today don't use any malware. You also have very interesting activity going on at the state actor level there's a North Korean group that we call Famous Chalima. And you may have seen some of the headlines recently where North Korean intelligence officers have been caught trying to get into more than 100 U.S. private sector organizations as employees. So they're interviewing with organizations, some of whom may even be in the room today. Hopefully not the spies, but the target organizations that they're trying to get jobs at, trying to pose as remote workers, get jobs, and get that sort of access. So that threat's very real. And then from a what's happening today in terms of some of the other techniques that are leveraged against organizations. Obviously, ransomware remains a threat, but increasingly, there's this double, triple punch of data leak extortion. So it's not just the incident itself, the infiltration that is your incident, and that's your one-time event you have to rally behind, but it's what happens with that data that the adversary holds that they can leak and keep asking for money. So then there can be this perpetual victimization. And then on top of that, you have what you're referring to with Salt Typhoon, where you have nation-state actors looking to do this sort of gap analysis of what do different organizations have and where are those gaps where they know either, some of our infrastructure has actually been caught, in a CALIA database or elsewhere, or good, it looks like nobody knows that we're leveraging this legitimate infrastructure as our own, and that's the sort of thing that nation-state actors are doing as well.
Chris?
I mean, obviously, Drew's much more plugged into the day-to-day of all of these challenges. But the fact of the matter is that everybody should assume that you're a target. That's the bottom line more than anything else. Is that watching at the periphery of the network and being ready to report quickly. And to get engaged with either your law firm or your internal counsel, and especially your frontline cybersecurity people, it's a critical part of it's mission critical for every business at this point.
I mean, I don't know if I have much to add. That was very interesting, wonderful discussion. I think the only thing I would say too is keep in mind that we focus so much on data breach obligations and kind of working around data breach obligations and minimizing these notification obligations, and they are focused on breaches of personal data. But it's much broader than that, right? The resiliency is key, as everybody has said, but your reporting obligations are broader now too, beyond just a data breach, right? Cybersecurity incidents don't require a data breach, and they're broadly reportable under a number of laws, right? So you can no longer think of it from a compliance and reporting perspective as, it's not personal data, so it's not reportable, because that's just not true anymore.
Well, there's been quite a number of movements around, for public companies reporting in your 10Ks and 10Qs,
Yes,
security incidents and describing how they've been addressed.
Yep, and we've got the new, the NIS2 in the EU coming out, and that's going to require very broad reporting of a very broad category of incidents by a very broad category of companies. India has been requiring it for a long time, right? So, I mean, these things are,
Yeah, and look, I think the only thing I'd add there is, again, if you're looking at data sets, to give you another example, and I'd say look at your vendors, because you transfer a lot of data to vendors. I had one client who had been in litigation with a part of the federal government for about 20 years and had given an e-discovery vendor the emails of all the senior executives and board of directors over that period for e-discovery purposes. And you can imagine the fun when that vendor got hit and all the data got exfiltrated, and you can imagine what was in there. And so while there were probably privacy concerns, what they were really concerned about is what were we saying about this particular agency that we're still litigating with, and if that comes out, like what happens? And so, again, you really have to look at it from a broader perspective than just, do I have personal data about somebody? You may have very sensitive data. And Drew, you, again, are on the front line of this. Maybe you can weigh in on, without naming names, like what you've seen and where it's not, the main concern with the data isn't even the personal data part, but the damage to the company, whether it's brand or reputation.
Yeah, we see that a lot. And even in terms of by proxy, evidence of the way adversaries work is even what we see with how quickly adversaries move laterally through a network. So an adversary will get a beachhead, so to speak, where I'm trying to channel General Mattis, since we had to follow him. into one system, and then quickly try to move laterally to get the data that they're actually interested in, or move through a whole supply chain. What we've seen is each year that breakout time decreases. And so now, on average, with all the data we see over the course of a year, on average, it's 62 minutes from when an adversary first gets into a network and then is able to actually move to other systems. It used to be hours years ago. And the fastest we've ever seen is 7 minutes by an adversary. And that notion of moving to the supply chain, there has been in the years past even where limo companies were infiltrated. And then the limo company was used as a way of orchestrating a phishing campaign to then get legitimate credentials from the target that they really wanted. So sometimes it's not even in your tech supply chain. It could even be through other vendors that you're using.
Yeah, and if you're a company who's acquiring a lot of other companies, that presents a real risk too when you're bringing other companies on and you haven't fully integrated them into your network and system, but they're just sitting there as a kind of a hole until you get that all shored up, and that presents a very big risk too.
Yeah, and look, I think maybe just quick show of hands. How many people in the audience know what a 0 day is? Not a ton. So look, you can do the best job you can on your internal controls for cyber. You can't control the software security, right? I mean, you can try to diligence it, but it's really hard, particularly if you're not a software company. And so some of the vulnerabilities you're dealing with are these 0 days, which is where there's a flaw in the software that allows somebody to get in and start penetrating your network and moving, to Drew's point, moving laterally. And so when you look at cyber, again, I can come in and build the best cyber program for you around for internal, but you may have vulnerabilities you just don't know about in your software supply chain. And a lot of the attacks these days are exploiting 0 days. And so again, just keeping in mind, you've got to make sure your software supply chain is as tight as it can be. I think on that point, as we kind of pivot out of cyber and maybe go to crypto, one final point from me is, what we did in the late 90s, we had two things happen. We moved our physical supply chains overseas because we started exporting jobs and manufacturing. At the same time, we wired the entire world and allowed basically threat actors to attack us remotely. Like China couldn't run espionage on us the same way they can now because they don't have to even be in country. And so one thing, again, to keep in mind is because of the internet, because of the connectivity, in the current iteration, you're just wide open to threat actors coming in. And I see our time just got adjusted, so I'm going to hit crypto.
Is that adjusted positively?
It depends on who you ask, I guess, and how much they like our panel. So, Chris, I'm going to start with you. Crypto, where's it going? And that little event in November, how do you think that could impact it?
So what's happening right now in the space, and I always emphasize that my fund is more focused on blockchain-based companies. I think that blockchain-based systems and databases are going to replace every system of importance that we have in terms of financial reporting, in terms of everything else. But it's going to take 20 years for this to happen. The infrastructure is going to be critical. To have publicly available ledgers on things that are queryable is an incredibly powerful tool for checking everything. In the meantime, a lot of the public discussion is about cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin and Ethereum. And my solid advice there is Bitcoin and Ethereum are fine. They're not going anywhere. They're going to go away. Everything else is sort of speculative right now. Solana has made its own mark at this point, but Bitcoin and Ethereum on that front are the important things to focus on the front. But companies are using blockchains, and sometimes they're using tokens to encourage better behavior around these things. And obviously for this panel especially, there's a lot of ransomware happens, and the people are expecting to get paid usually in Bitcoin. That will continue, unfortunately. And securing your systems is the best way to deal with that. From the fund, I will be investing in a number of security companies that are focused on making sure that people get locked down in a blockchain-oriented environment.
Great. Well, I think we are ending right on time, so we'll do that for you. And I know we have Mark O'Connor coming up. So thank you all. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.